As the sun slid down behind hills or rooftops, and the world softened into shadow, ancient women prepared not just their homes, but their bodies for rest. And just as waking began with changing clothes, so too did sleep arrive with another quiet transformation. There were no pajamas, no drawstring flannels or branded shirts, but there were garments of the night clothes, worn only in the still hours, when voices were hushed and oil lamps flickered softly against the walls. In ancient Rome, a woman might remove her stola, fold it over a bench or hook, and slip into a soft tunica, simple, loose, unbelted. It hung quietly against her body like the evening air. No jewelry remained, no sandals, just bare feet against cold stone, and the whisper of cloth brushing skin. Her hair, unpinned, fell across her shoulders, and the weight of the day lifted with each fold placed aside. In northern villages of medieval Europe, woolen garments were traded for linen shifts, coarser than we might imagine, but softer than what was worn in the fields. These night shifts were often passed down, patched many times, with seams that held both sleep and memory. And as a woman pulled it over her head, perhaps while sitting on the edge of a straw-filled mattress, she did so slowly by the low light of a candle or the orange blush of a fading fire. She would listen to the night, to wind moving against wood, to the soft cluck of hens, to a child sighing in a cradle nearby, and all the while the cloth settled around her body, not tight, not stiff, just enough to separate the world outside from the quiet within. In places where sleep was communal, families sharing the same space. Often the same bed-changing clothes was done behind a hanging curtain, or sometimes with one's back turned. Modesty was not about hiding completely. It was about intention, about small choices that said, "This is private now. This is rest." And in warmer regions, like Egypt or Mesopotamia, changing into sleep cloths often meant removing a layer rather than adding one. A woman might lie in a thin, sleeveless linen shift, the same one she wore under her calasiris all day, now cooled by nighttime breezes coming through high windows or open rooftops. But no matter the land, no matter the fabric, there was one shared truth. To change clothes before bed was to mark the end of the day. It was a signal, soft and silent, that the work was over and the dreaming could begin. She folded what was worn, placed it near, rested her hands on her lap for just a moment, and then, with slow steps, she would lie down, wrapped in cloth, wrapped in night, wrapped in time. Not every day in the ancient world was marked by toil or sleep. There were days of celebration, 2 festivals, weddings, solstices, market days. And when these moments came, women prepared with special care, unfolding garments not touched in weeks, sometimes months, that waited quietly in storage baskets or clay jars. Changing into festive clothing was not hurried. It was deliberate, slow, a calm layering of fabric and memory. In ancient Greece, during the festival of Athena, women might retrieve their finest peplos perhaps, one woven just for the event. Changing into it meant brushing off stored dust, shaking out folds, stiffened by time, and smoothing the hem with palms, still dusted with flour or soil. The process was not about dazzle. It was about reverence, about honoring the day through what one wore. In ancient Egypt, festival dress meant brighter linen, freshly laundered, perfumed with myrrh or lotus oil. A woman might sit with her mother or grandmother, carefully applying kohl around the eyes and placing beads into her hair, section by section, but always quietly, as though waking the cloth, not commanding it. And when it came time to change, The woman would stand tall, raise her arms, and feel the cool rush of linen slip over her skin. She would not speak, she would not rush, and those helping her would know just where to pull, where to tie, where to pause. Because festival garments were not everyday things, they were treated like guests, honored and rare. In medieval villages, feast days brought the unveiling of saved garments, the once-year dresses, perhaps dyed in madder red or faded blue. These were pulled from chests lined with dried herbs, their scent rising faintly like a memory. Changing into them often required help, not because the garments were complicated, but because the moment deserved more than a single pair of hands. Sometimes a woman would mend a hem the night before by firelight, in silence, her needle rising and falling like a slow breath. Other times she would add a ribbon or a pin or a woolen brooch passed down through 3 generations. And when she dressed in the morning, she didn't look in a mirror. She looked at how the fabric moved, how it felt on her shoulders, how it whispered around her ankles. She might adjust the neckline, tug gently at the sleeve, and then she would walk to the door, the hem brushing softly with each step, the sound of it barely rising above the hush of dawn. To change into festival clothes was not just to mark the diet, was to step briefly into something sacred, something shared. And when the feast ended and the torches dimmed, she would undress in the same stillness, folding each piece with gratitude, as though saying goodbye to an old friend. Just as garments marked joy and gathering, they also carried the weight of sorrow. In ancient times, when grief entered a household, it did not come quietly and yet. The response was often silence, expressed not through words, but through cloth. Changing clothes during mourning was a quiet ritual, a transformation not of style, but of spirit, a soft outward sign of inward weight. In ancient Rome, when death touched a family, women would remove their colored garments and change into a dark, muted toga pulla woolen cloak, heavier and plainer than their daily wear. The act of changing was solemn. They didn't speak much. A friend or servant might help them untie the familiar ribbons, lift away bright folds, and replace them with fabric that carried no decoration. The movement was the same, but the meaning was different. Even the air seemed heavier. In ancient Jewish customs, women in mourning might tear a piece of their garment, a visible mark of sorrow. The cloth wasn't discarded or replaced. It stayed torn, a reminder of what had changed. And to change clothes after such an act was careful, thoughtful, slow. In early medieval Europe, women mourning a loss often wore coarse black wool or gray linen, not because it was fashionable. Fashion had no place in grief, but because it showed respect. It spoke for them. When words failed, the cloth carried the meaning. A widow might fold away her wedding tunic, laying it gently in a cedar chest, brushing its hem once before closing the lid. She would choose instead a dress without ornament, without color, one that made no sound when she walked. To change into mourning dress was to enter a different time, one where hours passed slower and the world was a little quieter. And even long after the burial, women would keep those garments near, not always worn, but close, a bundle on a shelf, a folded shawl in the corner. Because the act of changing back to normal clothes, that took time. Some women changed back piece by piece. A darker shift remained, but a new belt was added, or perhaps a dull tunic paired with a brighter scarf. And each morning, the choosing of what to wear became a quiet question. Am I ready? Is today different than yesterday? Clothing didn't hurry them. It waited. It allowed, it understood. And so the garments of mourning, though simple, though faded, held as much meaning as the finest dress, because they were worn with purpose, folded with memory, and changed with the slow return of peace. As time moved, so did the seasons, and just like the rhythm of planting and harvesting, the rhythm of dressing followed the weather. Not because fashion demanded it, but because nature required it. Women had to adapt, not with brand new clothes every few months, but with layers, with textures, with care. In summer, garments were lighter, breezier. In ancient Egypt, a woman might sleep in the same linen she wore by day, the fabric so thin it caught the moonlight through the roof beams. Changing meant little more than loosening a belt, rinsing her skin, and lying down on woven mats beneath the stars. But as colder winds crept into the village paths and smoke began to curl from chimney holes, clothing shifted too, slowly, thoughtfully. In northern lands, Gaul, Britannia, Germania, women prepared for the cold like preparing for a long journey. They brought out thicker woolen shifts, brushed furs, cloaks lined with coarse cloth, to change into winter, where was to wrap not only the body, but also the self. It meant tucking hands into sleeves, pulling shawls across shoulders, securing hoods with wooden pins or horn toggles. These pieces weren't extravagant. Most were plain, sometimes scratchy, but they were dependable. Often the entire family sat near the fire to change dressing for the evening or undressing after a long day. A woman might help her child pull off a damp tunic. Then she'd unfasten her own layers, first the cloak, then the outer gown, then the chemise beneath, folding each near the hearth so they'd be warm again in the morning. In Japan, the seasons were reflected not just in the garments, but in the color combinations of layers. A woman's robe might show pale green in spring, deep crimson in autumn. Changing into seasonal clothing was almost ceremonial. Silk was chosen not just for feel, but for the message its colors whispered. A soft green robe might say, "The trees are returning." A dull blue might say, "The rain has come to stay." In all these places, in all these times, changing clothes with the season wasn't an event. It was part of life's flow, gentle, reliable, quiet. And even when garments were reused, repurposed, handed down from elder to child, they held within them a story of the seasons before. A little fray at the hem remembered last winter's frost. A faded shoulder spoke of last summer's sun. Women didn't need closets full of choices. They needed only what suited the moment, what warmed them, cooled them, covered them, just enough to walk through the world in peace. And when the seasons turned again, the ritual repeated, not because it was commanded, but because it felt right. As natural as breathing, as steady as the earth itself. In the hush of ancient homes, the earliest clothing a girl wore was rarely stitched with precision. It was soft, simple, and often made from the leftovers of older garments. A strip of linen here, a patch of wool there. Mothers wrapped their infants in swaddling cloths, binding them gently, not tight, but snug enough to mimic the feeling of the womb. These cloths weren't stylish. They were practical, worn, warm. As the child grew, her clothing grew with her. In many ancient societies, girls didn't wear miniature versions of adult clothing. They wore tunics cut wide, sleeves loose, hems let down as legs lengthened. There were no tags to scratch at the neck, no sizing charts, just careful eyes and clever hands that adjusted what was needed. A mother might take a dress that once fit her older daughter and cut it down the middle, sew it again for the younger. Not wasteful, not hurried, just thoughtful, reuse, quiet continuity. Changing clothes, for children, was often more playful. There were no rituals, no modesty yet. A girl might lift her arms and laugh as fabric was pulled over her head. She might wriggle her toes as her mother tugged up a woolen sock, hand-stitched and worn soft by many washings. But slowly, with age, the process changed. A girl began to learn the rhythm of dressing, how to tie her sash, how to fold a wrap just so, how to brush off dust from yesterday's hem. She learned by watching, not with instructions, but with experience, with time. In ancient India, she might practice wrapping a child-sized sari beside her mother, the fabric slipping unevenly, the pleats too wide, but the motions already familiar. In Rome, she might begin tying her own cingulum, the corded belt, around her tunic, pulling it snug with pride. In a Norse village, she might wear her first woolen overdress at the harvest feast, its brooches borrowed for a day from her grandmother. Each time she changed, she stepped a little closer to womanhood, but there was no rush. Childhood lingered longer then. The world didn't demand speed, and when a girl reached the age where garments began to mean something more, when colors, fabrics, and fastenings hinted at her status, her readiness, her place in society, the act of dressing shifted again. Now, she changed not just with her hands, but with her thoughts, quietly, carefully, thoughtfully, and her garments, still handmade, still humble carried, not just warmth, but weight, because changing clothes in youth was not only about comfort, it was about learning who you were and who you were becoming. Of all the days in a woman's life, perhaps none called for such care in changing garments as her wedding day. The sun rose slowly, the world moved gently, but within the walls of her home, preparations had already begun before the light reached the doorway. Unlike the bright sparkle of modern ceremonies, ancient weddings were built on quiet symbolism, and the changing of clothes was not about impressing others, it was about honoring tradition, family, and a moment that would never return the same way again. In ancient Mesopotamia, a bride might wear a layered wool robe dyed in saffron or indigo. There were no zippers or corsets, only soft sashes and fabric carefully wrapped, folded, and held in place by brooches, pins, or girdles. A sister or aunt would assist her, lifting one section of cloth over the shoulder, smoothing creases with slow, practiced palms. There was silence, not tension, just the weight of the moment. The room smelled faintly of oil and pressed flowers. Outside, drums might have begun their distant beat, but inside, the world stood still. In ancient Greece, brides wore a chiton, sometimes over a fine linen underdress, belted high at the waist. Over this was draped the himatiana, long cloak of wool. Her hair was brushed and tied with simple cords, or perhaps braided with herbs or leaves. The final act of changing came with the veil, lowered softly across her face, not to hide, but to represent transition, a moment between girlhood and the life ahead. Roman brides wore flame-colored veils and white tunics, tied with a special knot, the knot of Hercules, said to bring fertility. Only her husband was allowed to untie it that night, but in the daylight, as she changed, it was her mother who helped dress her, whispering advice or blessings, adjusting the folds with hands that had done the same years before. In some African cultures, the bride wore bright, layered wraps, often gifted by elder women, each one symbolic. The first wrap might represent her childhood, the next her womanhood, and the last her step into marriage. To change into these garments was not merely dressing, it was storytelling, woven in cloth. And though the bride stood quietly, her mind was full. She thought not just of the wedding, but of the people who had dressed before her, and the daughters who might do the same one day under the same roof. Later, when the ceremony was complete and the village quieted into twilight, the garments would be removed just as slowly, carefully folded, laid aside, not thrown, not forgotten, because they had marked a moment too sacred to rush. And as she slipped into her simpler nightcloth, now a wife, her hands still remembered the weight of the wedding veil, and her heart, perhaps fluttering still, began to settle into the soft rhythm of what came next. Not all garments were worn for beauty or for ceremony. In ancient times, clothing often served another, quieter purpose to protect, not just from cold or sun, but from gaze, from spirit, from misfortune. When a woman stepped outside, whether into a dusty marketplace, a windy hillside, or a temple courtyard, she did not dress just for weather. She dressed to shield herself from judgment, from danger, from the invisible beliefs that shaped the world around her. In ancient Arabia, women wrapped themselves in flowing veils and abayas, not as mere fashion, but as a form of respect to the community, to God, to family. The act of changing into those outer layers before stepping beyond the threshold was done in stillness, a pause, a moment to remember. This is not just fabric, this is intention. Similarly, in early India, the draping of the saris palutha loose end was not accidental. It could be pulled over the head in modesty, used to shield the sun, or as a sign of reverence before elders or deities. The act of changing from a home sari into a public one was small, often silent, and deeply meaningful. The way it fell, the way it was folded each, told others who she was and what space she was entering. In medieval Europe, peasant women wore aprons over their dresses, not just for cleanliness, but also to mark the line between home and task. To change into an apron meant readiness, protection, and at the end of the day, to untie it was a release, the soft signal that the outside world had been left behind. Nomadic women of the Mongol steppe wore thick robes, belted tightly and layered, not only to guard against the icy wind, but also to carry knives, small tools, and pouches for fire starting. Their clothes were part of survival. And yet, even in the harshest conditions, the changing of garments, sun wrapping, folding, layering, was done with rhythm, with calm. In ancient Slavic traditions, red threads were sewn into the seams of undergarments to ward off illness and envy. Women changed into these clothes, not with fear, but with a sense of being quietly watched, overprotected by the old ways, even if they didn't always understand them fully. And in many places, hair itself was part of the garment. In early Christian traditions, married women covered their heads. In Orthodox households, changing meant tying a scarf or shawl before prayer or travel, not because they were told, but because it felt right, a garment for the soul. So each time a woman changed her clothes before going out, or changed them again when she returned, it wasn't about being seen, it was about being whole, about saying, "This is who I am right now, this is where I belong." And the cloth, always patient, always willing, held that meaning without ever speaking a word. In ancient times, a woman's relationship with her clothing didn't end once the garment was changed. No, after the cloth left her body, it entered another gentle, sikola, slower ritual of care, of repair, of washing and mending and remembering. Garments were precious. They weren't made to be thrown away. Each piece, from tunic to wrap to scarf, was kept, worn again, patched again, softened over time, like a river stone that grew smoother with every season. Washing clothes was not a quick task. There were no taps, no machines, no powders with neat instructions. Only water, hands, and time. In ancient Greece, women would walk to public fountains or nearby rivers with bundles of linen balanced on their hips. They would kneel on smooth stone, their skirts tucked up, and begin to scrub, not violently, just firmly. The soap, when they had it, came from boiled down animal fat or crushed ash and lye. It didn't smell sweet. It smelled like effort, like earth. Clothing would be soaked, twisted, and beaten gently on flat stones, then rinsed, wrung, and lifted toward the sun. Linen would grow stiff as it dried on low branches. Wool would be laid flat, away from heat. Each cloth carried a memory, and the hands that washed it remembered. In other cultures, like early China or Mesoamerica, washing was done in shared spaces. Women gathered together, speaking softly, laughing sometimes, exchanging news as they worked. The garments changed, but the rhythm was the same. Soak, scrub, rinse, lay out, a quiet togetherness. Mending was just as important. If a seam broke or a hem frayed, a woman would not sigh and throw it away. She would sit quietly, thread her needle, and begin to repair. It didn't matter if the stitch was perfect. What mattered was that the garment was loved, was needed. In the cold light of morning, or by firelight in the evening, women sat and mended sleeves, cuffs, collars. They added patches not to hide, but to strengthen. Some even embroidered over the mending, turning repair into beauty. Every needle prick was a whisper. You still matter. You're not done yet. Children's clothing was often remade from older fabric. A mother might take her worn tunic and reshape it into something smaller, something new. She'd hum softly as she worked, and the child would wait beside her, already imagining the sleeves. Even storage had its own tenderness. Clothes were folded, not stuffed, placed into woven baskets with dried herbs, lavender, mint, or rosemary to keep pests away and to lend a faint sweetness when worn again. The care of clothes wasn't a task, it was a way of life, a form of thankfulness, a way to hold time with your fingers, because the clothes a woman wore were never just clothes. They were history, they were connection, they were love folded, washed, and mended again and again. Far from the noisy villages and humble firesides, there were women who slept not on straw, but beneath embroidered canopies, in high stone towers or walled palaces. Queens and noblewomen lived lives shaped by protocol, expectation and, yes, even in sleep, by clothing. But even here, in marble halls and candlelit chambers, the nightly act of changing clothes remains slow and personal. In Renaissance Italy, a noblewoman might begin her evening routine long before sleep came. After the final course of supper was cleared away and the lute music faded from the hall, she would return to her chambers, followed by handmaids with oils and soft cloths. Her outer gown, heavy velvet, jeweled, was slowly unlaced, each ribbon untied, each hook gently unfastened. The silence in the chamber wasn't cold, was expectant, soft, familiar. Beneath the grand layers were simpler linens, and beneath those, eventually, the garments of night. Night clothes among the nobility weren't about show. They were often plain, but finely made. Long chemises of soft linen, sometimes edged with lace. Loose robes, tied gently at the waist. In colder regions, fur-lined slippers might be set by the bedside. In warmer lands, A woman might wear nothing but a sheer layer, more like a veil than a dress cool against sun-kissed skin. A noble woman would sit at her vanity, brushing her hair slowly. 100 strokes, not because she had to, but because it was tradition, because it gave her time to let the day fall away. Her handmaids folded her gowns, placed slippers near the fire, and lit the last candles before retreating quietly. And when the lady finally lay down, her nightdress would rustle faintly as she adjusted beneath silken covers. The scent of pressed rose petals in a nearby bowl filled the air. The sounds were distant hooves in the courtyard, a lone owl, the wind high above the towers. To change clothes before bed, even for royalty, was not just habit. It was gentle, private, necessary, for the queen in her castle and the farm girl on her mat shared the same truth. The body must be soothed before sleep. Garments must be softened. Movement must slow. And the world, no matter how grand, must quiet down. There was no velvet that could outmatch the comfort of clean linen, and even in rooms hung with tapestries and guarded by stone, sleep came the same way it always had, draped in fabric, settled by stillness, welcomed in silence. In the ancient world, clothing could speak without words, and among the most gentle, most symbolic of garments were veils, shawls, scarves, the light layers women changed, not for warmth or comfort, but to communicate identity, status, belief, or intent. To change into one of these soft, drifting fabrics was an act both ordinary and sacred. It was subtle, but it said much. In Mesopotamia, women of higher status covered their heads with veils when stepping outside, while lower-class women and enslaved women were forbidden from doing so. So to change into a veil before leaving the home was indeed just modesty, was a sign of rank, of protection, of recognition. The motion was slow, practiced, one hand holding the fabric at the forehead, the other drawing it back across the crown, securing it behind the neck or beneath a circlet. In ancient Israel, the veil was sometimes used as a sign of betrothal. Rebekah, when meeting Isaac for the first time, took her veil and covered herself. That simple, action-gentle, quiet spoke volumes. It was a symbol of transition, of reverence, of readiness. In Persia, finely woven head coverings were draped over hair that had been brushed with scented oils. To change into one's outdoor scarf was to shift from home to public, from private self to the face shown to the world. The movement was elegant, done in a mirror's reflection, perhaps, or with the help of a sister, not rushed, not idle, just necessary. In India, the gunghot, or veil, drawn from the end of the sari, served a similar purpose. Young women, especially in more traditional households, would pull the gung hat over their head or face in the presence of elders or strangers. Changing into it meant stepping into a different role, a daughter, in-law, a guest, a worshipper. The fabric was often transparent, yet its meaning was solid, strong, and in the deserts of North Africa, the Tuareg women wore indigo-dyed scarves that tinted the skin blue with time. Wrapping one around the face before braving the hot winds was both protective and deeply cultural. Each woman knew just how to tie it, how to make it stay, how to make it flow. At night, these light garments were removed, folded, and placed beside the day's clothing. They were not tossed aside. They had done their work. They had spoken when the wearer had chosen to stay silent. And the next morning, they would be picked up again, shaken out, draped once more, because even the lightest layer of cloth can carry the weight of meaning. And the act of changing into a veil or scarf was indeed just an addition to an outfitted, was a continuation of tradition, a way of joining the women who had done the same for generations, quietly, gracefully, without needing to explain, in the hush of temples, in the shadows of shrines, and within the worn walls of ancient sanctuaries. There were clothes not worn for beauty or survival, but for worship. To change into sacred garments was not a daily act. It was occasional, special, sometimes rare, but always reverent. Women in the ancient world prepared for spiritual rituals the way one prepares to meet something larger than themselves, not with fear, but with quiet respect, with care in every fold, with hands that did not rush. In ancient Egypt, priestesses wore white linen robes, unadorned but purified, washed in sacred waters, dried beneath the open sky. Before wearing them, the women bathed fully. They anointed their skin with oils, sometimes crushed lotus or frankincense. The changing of garments became a sacred passage, from the world of soil and smoke into the world of spirit. In ancient Greece, those who served as oracles or temple keepers wore garments of specific color and cut, a peplus tied in a certain way, a girdle wrapped thrice, or a veil drawn precisely over the forehead. These weren't rules of fashion. They were traditions born from myth and memory. A woman might kneel before a statue of Athena, lift her arms, and allow another to dress her not as a servant, but as a sacred helper. The cloth was not just cloth, it was a layer between the divine and the mortal. In Hindu temples, women wore clean saris, often white or yellow tied, freshly before entering for puja. The changing into this garment, even if only steps away from the altar, was a reset, a signal to the self. This is different. This is sacred. In early Christian traditions, women wore head coverings during worship, not for shame, but for humility. The act of pulling the cloth over the head was not showy. It was deeply personal, a sign of devotion, done silently, done faithfully. Even in small village rituals, lighting lamps, weaving garlands, sweeping prayer spaces, women often changed their clothes first, not into extravagance, but into cleanliness, simplicity, cloth that had been kept aside for this purpose only, to remove the dust of the road, to brush off the burden of the day, to approach the divine as one's truest, gentlest self. And after the ritual ended, after the offering was given, or the prayer whispered, the garments were changed again, folded neatly, returned to shelves lined with turmeric, with incense ash, with hope. These sacred garments were not seen by many, but they were felt deeply, because to change for the divine was never just a matter of fabric. It was a matter of presence, of being fully here, fully still, and the cloth remembered the prayers long after the voice had gone quiet. There were times in the flow of ancient life when women had to leave the circle of home, perhaps to walk across fields to another village, to visit family, to bring offerings, to trade grain, or to follow a caravan. These journeys, whether short or far, called for special kinds of clothing. To change for travel was not a hurried moment. It was a careful preparation. Women knew that the road, however familiar, carried wind and dust, uneven paths, and sudden cold, and so they reached for garments built to endure, not flashy, not ceremonial, but steady. In ancient China, women bound their legs in soft cloth strips before a journey to avoid chafing. Their layered tunics, worn long over loose trousers, were tied snugly with sashes. Over that, a traveling robe, often darker in shade to hide the marks of the road. A hat, wide-brimmed or cloth-wrapped, protected the skin, and tucked into belts or woven satchels, dried fruit, pressed herbs, small talismans. To change into travel clothes was to ready oneself, not just for the road, but for the unknown. In the arid lands of the Middle East and North Africa, women wrapped themselves in thick cloaks and headscarves, the fabric shielding them from sun by day and chill by night. These weren't fancy things. They were dyed with earth, sometimes faded from many miles. Changing into them meant standing quietly, folding and refolding, tucking the ends just so. Hands that knew each crease, each turn. And in ancient Europe, a woman might put on a woolen mantle clasped at the shoulder with bone or bronze. Beneath it, a shift, strong shoes, a pouch, sometimes even a knife, tucked at the waist not for harm, but for usefulness. Travel clothes were different, not just in look, but in how they made you feel. They were heavier, firmer. They said, "I'm going somewhere. I'm prepared." Sometimes a woman helped her daughter change into her first travel garments, straightened her cloak, adjusted her pack, tied the final cord, and then stepped back, watching her walk into the world. And when the journey was over, whether hours or days later, those clothes came off slowly, laid down by the door, dusted, smoothed, a silent exchange. You protected me. I'll care for you. Even then, the changing of garments bookended the road. One set for leaving, one set for returning. A rhythm, even in movement. And the cloth, like the road, held the story. Folds that had faced wind, stains that told of distance, and a scent that lingered long after the fire had warmed her home again. There were times in the flow of ancient life when women had to leave the circle of home, perhaps to walk across fields to another village, to visit family, to bring offerings, to trade grain, or to follow a caravan. These journeys, whether short or far, called for special kinds of clothing. To change for travel was not a hurried moment. It was a careful preparation. Women knew that the road, however familiar, carried wind and dust, uneven paths, and sudden cold. And so they reached for garments built to endure, not flashy, not ceremonial, but steady. In ancient China, women bound their legs in soft cloth strips before a journey to avoid chafing. Their layered tunics, worn long over loose trousers, were tied snugly with sashes. Over that, a traveling robe, often darker in shade, to hide the marks of the road. A hat, wide-brimmed or cloth-wrapped, protected the skin, and tucked into belts or woven satchels, dried fruit, pressed herbs, small talismans, the fabric shielding them from sun by day and chill by night. These weren't fancy things. They were dyed with earth, sometimes faded from many miles. Changing into them meant standing quietly, folding and refolding, tucking the ends just so. Hands that knew each crease, each turn, sometimes even a knife, tucked at the waist not for harm, but for usefulness. Travel clothes were different, not just in look, but in how they made you feel. They were heavier, firmer. They said, "I'm going somewhere. I'm prepared." Sometimes a woman helped her daughter change into her first travel garments, straightened her cloak, adjusted her pack, tied the final cord, and then stepped back, watching her walk into the world. And when the journey was over, whether hours or days later, those clothes came off slowly, laid down by the door, dusted, smoothed, a silent exchange. You protected me. I'll care for you. Even then, the changing of garments bookended the road. One set for leaving, one set for returning. A rhythm, even in movement. And the cloth, like the road, held the story. Folds that had faced wind, stains that told of distance, and a scent that lingered long after the fire had warmed her home again. In the quietest corners of ancient homes, where voices softened and time seemed to slow, there came a moment when a woman changed her clothing, not for sleep, not for worship, not for travel, but for farewell, for mourning, for letting go, or the body of another in death was among the most tender changes of all. In ancient Egypt, when a woman passed on, her body was prepared with reverence, carefully washed, anointed with oils, wrapped in linen strips that had been blessed and dried under the desert sun. Her hair was sometimes braided, her jewelry placed gently with her. Her burial clothes were often simple, sometimes white, sometimes dyed with ochre or blue, but they were always clean, always folded first. The women who wrapped her hands and feet had done so many times before, and each time they whispered prayers not to rush the task, but to accompany the soul. In Greece and Rome, the dead were often dressed in white tunics before cremation or burial. Female relatives, especially mothers and daughters, did the work themselves. And for the living, too, changing clothes meant stepping into mourning. In ancient China, a widow wore coarse, white or hempen garments plain, unadorned, not to punish herself, but to show that the world had changed, that her spirit was turned inward now. The act of changing into mourning clothes was solemn, not loud, not dramatic, just deeply felt. In Europe, black became the color of loss, but even before that tradition took hold, women would cover their heads with shawls, remove jewelry, and wrap themselves in dark or faded cloth, not because anyone told them to, but because grief needed a uniform, and fabric helped carry the weight. Sometimes, in certain indigenous communities, the clothes of the deceased were burned or buried with them. Sometimes they were gifted to others after a time to continue their story. But before any of that, they were folded, held, and honored, because clothing was never just a covering. It was memory, it was skin, it was ritual. To change garments in grief was to say, I am not the same. And when the time came, weeks or months or moons later, to change out of mourning clothes, the moment was no less sacred. It meant letting in light again. It meant beginning to breathe in color, slowly, gently, patiently. As always, the garments waited, through centuries, across continents, through birth, sleep, work, worship, joy, grief, and every quiet moment in between. Clothes were never just garments. They were storytellers. The palm leaves brushing her ankles, the sound of sandals in the courtyard, the rough-woven sari of a village mother remembered the smell of rain on warm earth, the baby carried on her hip, and the rhythm of her footsteps along the well-worn path. The thick mantle wrapped around an old widow's shoulders remembered every morning she stepped out in silence, and every evening she folded it beside her lamp. Even after these women were gone, their clothes remained for a while, passed down, remade, reworn, or tucked into cedar-lined chests with bundles of dried flowers and notes written in faded ink. A hem could remind someone of a mother's care. A shawl could carry the scent of a sister long gone. A ribbon could hold the shape of a child's bow, tied so long ago. These were not just materials, they were memories held in weave and thread. And when the cloth finally frayed beyond use, when it could no longer be worn or mended, it was not discarded cruelly. It was often buried, burned, or repurposed into quilts, rags, or dolls. Still useful, still sacred, not moments. And the simple act of changing clothes was never just about what to wear. It was about knowing where you were going. and who you were becoming. So tonight, as you lie beneath your own blanket's soft, worn, familiar, know that you are part of this ancient, quiet story, a story of care, of rhythm, of presence. The garments may change, the rituals may shift, but the tenderness remains, always. Now close your eyes. Let the memories of fabric, of time, of women folding and unfolding lives in linen and wool wrap around you. Let the silence stretch. Let the story fade and sleep peacefully. Good night.